passed in the House Friday, dealing with border security and the deportation process for immigrant children. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the focus of a discussion today hosted by the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Among the topics, Israel's compliance with U.S. and international laws and its treatment of Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. One of the speakers is a Palestinian-American teenager who recently returned to the U.S. from Israel after having been arrested and detained by Israeli security forces. This is an hour and a half.
Organized by the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, entitled, "Is Israel Complying with U.S. and International Laws?" Examining Israel's impunity in injuring and killing civilians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. My name is Josh Ruebner. I am the policy director for the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, and we are extremely glad that a number of organizations have joined in helping to organize and to co-sponsor this event this afternoon, including American Muslims for Palestine, the Council on American-Islamic Relations, Defense for Children International Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, National Lawyers Guild, Peace Action, the Rachel Corrie Foundation for Peace and Justice, and the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. We're hosting this briefing, obviously, as everyone knows, at a time of sustained and disproportionate use of force that's being inflicted by Israel on the captive and besieged and occupied 1.8 million Palestinian residents in the Gaza Strip. And as we're gathered here today on Capitol Hill, I think it's incumbent upon us to ask ourselves whether Israel is following the tenets of U.S. law when it comes to its use of force against Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. The Arms Export Control Act strictly limits the uses that U.S. weapons can be used for by foreign countries to legitimate self-defense and to internal security. And our panelists will be addressing whether, in fact, these weapons are being used in this manner or not. We've seen Israel bomb and damage more than 160 schools and hospitals in the occupied Gaza Strip over the past 3 weeks. The U.S. Foreign Assistance Act states very clearly that any country that commits systematic violations of human rights is ineligible for any form of U.S. aid. And we know that the Leahy Law, which is part of the Foreign Assistance Act, cuts off any U.S. aid to units of any foreign military that engages in human rights abuses, and individuals who do so are restricted from gaining access to the United States by being denied visas. The question before us is, are we a country of laws? Are we a country which is going to insist upon the application of the very laws that were written in these halls of Congress? Or is Israel somehow above the law and free to neglect the restrictions of these laws? We'll be examining these questions, and for congressional staff, we have more information about this very issue for you to take back to your offices. And to elucidate, both from personal experience and from professional expertise, the use of force that Israel employs against Palestinians living under military occupation, we have a very rich lineup of speakers to address us here today. I'll introduce them all at once at first, and then they'll come up and speak in the order in which they were introduced. First, I would like to introduce Tariq Khdeir on my left. Tariq is a Palestinian-American teenager from Tampa, Florida, who was viciously beaten by the Israeli police on July 3rd of this year in Jerusalem in an incident which was caught on video. He will share with us his experiences going through that. Joining him is his mother, Suha Khdeir, also to the left, followed by Hassan Shibly, who is attorney for the Khdeir family and works for the Council on American-Islamic Relations in Florida. After that, we will hear from Brad Parker, to my right, who is an attorney and international advocacy officer for Defense for Children International Palestine, to be followed by Sunjeev Bery, who is the Middle East and North Africa advocacy officer for Amnesty International USA. And then rounding out the panel will be author Laila El-Haddad, who is the author of 2 books about the Gaza Strip, Gaza Mom and Gaza Kitchen, and is a former correspondent for Al Jazeera English based in the Gaza Strip. And because we are running overflow, we'll be repeating this conversation at 3:30 for those who are not able to get in and who can come back later. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Tariq Khdeir to come to the microphone.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be back safe and sound. When I traveled overseas, it was really tough. I've been through a really tough time. As I arrived in the airport, I was actually in the airport. They kept me in the airport for 10 hours. So, and still today, the Palestinian people are suffering. And actually I visited there for 6 weeks. And what I've been through is just a small taste of what they all go through. And the Palestinian people, they don't have rights. And they are not given their rights. And to tell you the truth, when I visited over there, I actually forgot that I had freedom. And for my cousins, I really wish they had the same freedom that I have living in America. And now that I'm back safe, I really appreciate all the freedom and rights that I have and given. And I'm just a kid that was born in Baltimore, and I moved to Tampa at 11 years old, and I'm 15 years old now, and I'm going into the 10th grade. And when I arrived in Palestine, it was so hard to believe what they've been going through. And my first friend over there, the first friend I made was Mohammed Abu Khdeir, the one that was murdered. And the day that he was kidnapped, it was really tough because I passed by him and I asked him a question. I was passing by and I asked him, "Did you want anything from the bakery?" Because me and him were really close friends. He's my best friend. So I asked him if he wanted anything from the bakery, and he's like, "Yeah, sure." I go to the bakery and I come back with a piece of bread, maybe a nice piece of bread, and I find the police there, and I don't find Mohammed there. So I'm really worried at this point. I'm like, there's something wrong. There has to be something wrong. And then I found out he was kidnapped. And at that point, we were losing time. Like every second was important. It was really tough at that point. And at that point I was scared for his life. I was scared that they were gonna do something that was it was gonna be hard. So, and when we found out that he died and he was murdered, he was stabbed and burnt alive. And it just made us think of like, why, how could they do that? How could they do that to a person? Like, I don't know. So later on that day, to even make it worse, they began to shoot at the whole city. They began to fire at everyone rubber bullets, and they hurt. So later on that day, I was on the side in an alley down the street from my house. I was in an alley and I was watching the protest. And at that point, I saw a couple people screaming from the left side of me, and they were screaming like a bunch of words. Behind them, I saw soldiers. So I was afraid myself. I was frightened and I was shocked. So everyone panicked and started running because the soldiers were running towards us. And we ran, well, some people ran out of the alley and some people jumped the fence that was in front of us. And I jumped the fence and I kept running for a little bit farther until the Israeli police grabbed me from behind me, slammed my face into the floor, zip-tied my hands behind my back, and started to kick me and punch me in the face and in the ribs. I later on, after a little bit of them beating me, I later on fell unconscious. So I had no idea what was going on after that. Well, I felt the beating for the beginning of it. Then I woke up blindfolded in the jail. They took me to jail right away with no medical treatment, nothing. So at that point, I didn't know what to do. I was confused and I was in so much pain. They didn't take me to the hospital until after 6 hours into the jail. Like, I heard that my dad was out of the jail and trying to get me to a hospital, nearest hospital, so I can get some medical treatment, but they wouldn't let him, they wouldn't let me go until after 6 hours. And they made me come back to the jail after a couple of hours in the hospital. So I stayed in the jail for 4 days. And on the fourth day, I had a court date. I went to the court date and they sat me in a room for 6 hours until they took person by person for their court date. And it was my turn, and I actually went. I had waited 6 hours. I almost fell asleep in the room. So I go, and I met my parents in this room where I saw a judge and a couple of other people. There was a translator right next to me, so she translated everything for me because they were talking Hebrew. And then they released me on house arrest. They put me on house arrest for 9 days. I had no charges from the beginning. I was never charged. And right when I left Palestine, the day that I left Palestine, they raided my house. They raided my family's house. And they took my uncle and my cousins into custody with no charges. And I really want to thank all the supporters that supported me and made me feel so thankful that I'm American. And I'm really sad for my cousins that are still persecuted in Israel. I have 3 cousins that were arrested with me. They were taken to jail with me, and their names are Kareem, Mohammed, and Mahmoud. They're still in jail till now because they're not American like me. But it doesn't matter. All people should be treated equally. We should all have rights because we're all humans, and we were all created equally. We deserve to have rights. We deserve to be treated equally. And I think my cousins should be treated with the same rights that I have, because they should be treated with the same rights because of how Israel treats the Israelis with those rights. So they've been going through a tough time. So if the Israelis would give the Palestinians the same rights that everyone is given these rights, then there could be a possibility of peace in the Middle East. I pray one day my cousins won't feel scared to walk outside, to be with their friends, to play outside, and not to be scared to go to the store and to have fun, just continue life and be a regular human. Well, I don't want them to be scared. So, thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Suha Khdeir. I'm the mother of Tariq Khdeir. I cannot describe the pain that I felt seeing my beloved son held in an Israeli prison without charges, denied medical care, and suffering from a brutal beating given to him by the Israeli police. When I first heard about his vicious attack, he faced at the hand of the Israeli police. I saw his bloody face and his swollen face and his unconscious body in the hospital. I feared for his life. I didn't know whether my son was going to survive or not. I could not bear to watch the video of his beating. What if he was screaming for help? I could not be by his side to comfort him. When I arrived at the hospital to see him, there was an Israeli police officer guarding his door. He refused to let me in at first, and I pleaded to him. I told him, but I'm his mother, until my husband convinced him finally to let me see my son. When I got the chance to go in and see him, before I got in, the Israeli police officer told me that I could not get near him, touch him, or speak to him. When I looked over at him, it was like looking at someone I didn't know I was meeting for the first time. His face was distorted. He did not look normal. He was sleeping, and I wasn't used to seeing him sleep at that time because he liked to stay up and, with his friends. We were on vacation, and it was midnight, and I knew that he always told me, Mom, can I stay up? So when I saw him in that state, I thought he was dead. I fell into a state of shock, and my husband took me off to the side, and I told him to stay in the hospital because I didn't know what could happen next. He was handcuffed to the hospital bed as well. I went home. The next day, Josh Wagner from the U.S. consulate had contacted me and told me he had made an appointment at the jailhouse to visit Tariq. So we all went. When we got there, we were told that we weren't allowed to see him. Josh Wagner proceeded to tell them that he had an appointment, and he was persistent, and he told them that he wasn't going to leave until he was able to see Tariq that day. He called the U.S. Embassy and the Israeli Embassy for 3 hours back and forth until finally they let him in by himself to see Tariq. I told him a couple of things before he went in. I said, please make sure he's okay, make sure he's getting his antibiotics, because I was told he was given antibiotics, but they were in Hebrew, and he doesn't read Hebrew. So at that point, he was in the jail with the same people, which were the Israeli police that beat him, so I didn't know what to expect from them next. Were they going to give him the antibiotics that he needed? Were they going to comfort him with the comfort that he needed? Because they took him out of the hospital just a few hours after a little bit of medical attention that he received. And with his condition, he needed comfort. He needed to be in an air-conditioned, comfortable bed with people who could comfort him and be able to take his medication. I'm grateful to be back in America, safe with my son. But I know Palestinians go through what my son faced every day of their lives. Tariq was not able to grieve his cousin's death as a result of the beating Israeli police gave him that same day that his cousin was brutally murdered by Israeli extremists, as we are still grieving today. Instead of the police protecting us, they taunted us and told us that Muhammad was just the first to be killed and that 300 Palestinians would be killed for the 3 Israeli teenagers who were killed. We did not kill those 3 Israeli teenagers. Why were they doing this to us? My son and family have been very traumatized by this whole experience. Our cousins are still in jail till this day, and the only reason Tariq got out was because he was an American and his beating was caught on tape. While some Israeli officials tried to justify the vicious beating my son received by smearing his name, my son has never been charged with any crime. The lack of sympathy that they showed towards my son's beating was just unbearable for me. Nothing can justify restraining the hands of a 15-year-old child and beating him unconscious. And even after he was unconscious, they proceeded to kick him in the face. Although as Americans we enjoy great freedom in America, in Jerusalem we felt treated worse than second-class citizens by the Israeli government, who treated us differently because we had a different religion and ethnicity. Like my Palestinian cousins, I felt that my family had no rights. My son was viciously attacked while in custody. He was in jail for 4 days. We were forced to pay a $1,000 bond, and my son faced 9 days of house arrest away from his family, although he committed no crime and faced no charges. This ruined the rest of his vacation. When we left America, Israeli police raided the family home we were staying and arrested all the males in the household. They are still being held today without any charges. The Israeli police involved in the beating of my son must be held accountable so that no other mother must go through the pain that I went through. Most of the officers involved in the beating and denial of medical care have yet to face any repercussion. My son still suffers from body aches and pain and headaches, not to mention the emotional trauma he must now struggle through. I just pray that America and the world can have the same sympathy for the countless children who are wrongfully arrested or even killed by Israel, who do not carry a U.S. passport like my son Tariq. None of this would have happened if the Israeli government valued the life of my son Tariq and other Palestinian Muslims and Christian children in the same way they value the life of Israeli children. Right now in Gaza, so many children are dying, mostly women and children. Someone needs to take a stand and stop this now. Not later, not tomorrow, now. If it was the other way around, where Israeli civilians were being killed, this would have been dealt with differently. It's not fair. The life of a Palestinian in Gaza should be valued as much as the life of any human being. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those beautiful words, Suha, and thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate everyone's sacrifice and squeezing in Congressman Ellison and the many respected guests. Tariq's father, who just also walked in, welcome. We would also make a request that those in the hallway, maybe whoever's in the back, Hamdi, I see you, Tariq's uncle, can you just make sure everybody in the hallway is quiet so that people can hear without interruption? And again, thank you for everyone's patience and waiting. My name is Hassan Shibly, Hassan, last name Shibly, Shibly. I'm an attorney and executive director of CARE Florida, the Council on American-Islamic Relations, and attorney for the Khdeir family. CARE Florida is probably the largest civil rights advocacy organization that has full-time lawyers that help all victims of discrimination in Florida and victims of government harassment regardless of their race and religion. As an American attorney, what happened to Tariq Khdeir at the hands of a nation that claims to be a democracy and claims to be an ally of the United States and receives billions of dollars of foreign aid really boggles my mind. I mean, because what I've seen happen to Tariq, my client, and what I'm seeing right now happening to his cousins and his family members in retaliation is just unconscionable for somebody who's grown up in a legal system such as ours that respects ideas of due process, right? The judicial process, innocent until proven guilty, and so forth. There are three things that really disturbed me from a legal perspective in how Tariq and his family have been treated and are currently being treated. First, that the Israeli police can brutally beat a child whose arms are restrained without all the officers involved being brought to justice. You can watch the video. You can go to cairflorida.org, C-A-I-R Florida.org, under videos, and watch the video of Tariq's brutal beating. You see multiple officers were involved. They restrained his hands. One sat on him. The other kept kicking him in the face, kicking him in the guts until he went unconscious, continued to kick his unconscious body, and then dragged him by holding his hands behind his back. You can see the pool of blood left where they beat him. So far, only one of those officers has faced any repercussion, and that's a 15-day suspension. He may face criminal charges. We don't know for sure yet. None of the other officers involved faced any charges. At the same time, the police department, which denied him proper medical care for 6 hours and then took him to see a doctor very briefly. The doctor said Tariq has internal bleeding, he has blood in his urine, and he received severe kicks to the head. He needs to see a specialist, and he needs to go to see a specialist immediately. The Israeli police denied him that request, the request of their own doctor. Threw him back in jail for another 4 days without proper medical attention. So none of those officers have been suspended or brought to justice. And what kind of message does that send when, Israeli officers can brutally attack one of our own citizens? And it shouldn't matter whether either he's a citizen or not, a child. It's enough that he's a child. And yet, none of those officers, or maybe only one of those officers, faces any sort of repercussion. It almost gives the green light for the police to continue to treat the Palestinian people in such an inhumane way. I'm sure they did not know he was American when they did that, nor did they realize the repercussion that would come from the treatment that they did to him. This will only escalate the violence, because the Palestinian people will see that the Israeli officers can do whatever they want to them. There's no constructive means of engagement, and while nothing can ever justify terrorism, it only pushes people towards destructive engagement when the government that's supposed to protect them is actually brutally attacking them without any repercussions. So we need to ensure that that those officers who attacked Tariq are brought to justice, and that U.S. taxpayer dollars are not funding those kinds of police forces. The second issue that really disturbed me is that the Israeli police can indefinitely detain without detention Palestinian children in jail without charges. Tariq went through all this. To this day, he has not faced any charges, nor has he done anything wrong, nor will he be facing any charges. 3 of his cousins, who were also around his age, were beaten up and arrested with him. They're still in jail to this day without charges. It's unconscionable that a country that claims to be a democracy can lock up children indefinitely without charges, and that we are funding that nation. So this is something that we as lawmakers in this country, as the American public, really need to reconsider. Third, that the Israeli officials can with impunity retaliate against the family of Tariq Khdeir by ransacking his home and arresting Tariq's uncle and cousins the night that Tariq returned to the U.S. As Tariq mentioned, the night they left, they went in the home where Suha was staying, and they ransacked the place. We have the pictures available, and they arrested his uncle and cousins. They're still in this jail to this day without any charges, in what is very clearly retaliation because Tariq spoke out about the injustice that the Palestinian people are facing. What has become manifestly clear to me in my representation of the Khdeir family is that the Israeli government has an open double standard that treats a whole class of people worse than second-class citizens because they have a different ethnic background and a different religion. That's what this is all about, because they have a different ethnic background and a different religion. Palestinians are not treated equally before the law. My clients have not been treated equally before the law in Israel. Another example is the double standards we see in home demolitions. We know that those who brutally attacked Tariq's cousin Muhammad, their homes, not only did they attack him, but they burned him alive. That is terrorism. Now, their homes were not demolished. And thank God, because I do not believe the homes of any suspect should ever be demolished. That's collective punishment. It's against international law, certainly against U.S. law. Yet the homes of those terrible terrorists who brutally killed the 3 Israeli teens, their homes were demolished right away because the suspects were Palestinians. Again, that's a clear double standard. This kind of double standard will only escalate the conflict. It's not helping alleviate the conflict. Our government cannot continue to fund Israeli police and military so long as Israel continues to engage in gross human rights and civil rights violations and continues to treat an entire group of people differently because they are of different ethnic or religious origin. not only because such funding is immoral, but because it is contrary to U.S. national security, as victims of Israeli human rights violations may hold the U.S. accountable for the crimes committed by Israel that are made possible by our tax dollars. In light of the billions of dollars Congress authorizes for Israel annually, we're calling on members of Congress and the executive administration to do everything in their power to, one, ensure all officers involved in Tariq's beating are brought to justice so as to ensure that this never happens to any other child again. It doesn't matter whether that child is Israeli, Palestinian, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. It doesn't matter. All children should be treated equally under the law. Two, we're calling on the State Department to help secure the release of Tariq's cousins and family members who were wrongfully arrested in retaliation for Tariq speaking out. Three, we must condition further aid to Israel on Israel adopting laws and practices to ensure all people in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank are treated equally before the law, regardless of their race or religion. Four, we are calling on the State Department and Congress and the executive branch to do everything within their power to pressure Israel to ensure that all people have basic due process. There should not be a country in the world, especially not a country that calls itself an ally of the U.S., that can indefinitely detain children or any person without due process and without charges. Failure for the U.S. to take strong action to ensure that individuals who attack Tariq are brought to justice and the policies and practices which led to the beating are changed will only escalate the conflict, as Israel will feel it can continue to act with impunity. Think about what kind of message that sends the world. Ensuring all people have due process is in everyone's best interest. In fact, the best way to support Israel is to ensure that it abides by the highest standards of due process and the law. What happens to all the officers involved in Tariq's beating and the retaliation against his family and what action the U.S. takes will be very telling as to whether Israel tolerates the mistreatment of Palestinians on an institutional level and whether the U.S. will tolerate that sort of behavior. May God bless America and Israel with leadership that values all human life equally, regardless of race, religion, ethnic origin, or nationality. That will bring peace to the world. Thank you. God bless America, and God bless you all.
So thank you. It's refreshing, I think, in the times that we're working in now and living in to see a full room here and to have people flowing out into the hallway. It's a bit refreshing for the work that we're all involved in and the things that we're consumed with day to day. I'd first like to thank everybody for being here, sharing stories that are awful difficult to speak about. I can't imagine. I think as an American, with the privilege that we do have and the rights and freedoms that we take for granted, to think about a prolonged occupation that's gone on since 1967, where soldiers live near communities regularly, settlements cut throughout the West Bank, East Jerusalem. The occupation is unjust. That's all. I mean, that's it. At the heart of it, it's systemic impunity, right? You have arrests where teens, Palestinian teens, are targeted in particular communities that are located near settlements, military bases, roads used by Israeli settlers, really anything where the occupation has infrastructure, has its teeth. This is where Palestinian children particularly are impacted. So my organization, I work for Defense for Children International Palestine. We're the only Palestinian human rights organization that focuses specifically on children. So we started in 1991 as an organization that provided legal aid to Palestinian children charged in the Israeli military courts. In East Jerusalem, Palestinian children generally are brought within Israeli civilian courts. But the treatment is very much the same across the occupied Palestinian territory, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Tariq's case is horrific, but it's not exceptional. His case is a typical case. We document hundreds of cases of each year. We provide legal representation to kids, and you really have a system that provides very little legal protection, very little legal rights to children. Children are arrested from their homes in the middle of the night by heavily armed soldiers. They're blindfolded. Their hands are tied with plastic cords, generally behind their back. In 75% of cases that we document, there's some form of physical violence in varying degrees during the arrest, transfer, and interrogation phases. So this system really, it's set up to control people. And the military law, the military framework, really, it's not a justice system. It's a system of control. And you see that in the way that arrests play out. You don't see very many kids being arrested in the center of Ramallah, right? But if you go around Nablus in the northern West Bank, if you go by Hebron in the southern West Bank, where you have military presence, where you have settlers, where you have settler roads, these are the communities being impacted. From the cases that we document, the kids that we represent, it doesn't matter if you throw stones or not. It really doesn't, because the system isn't based on evidence. It's not based on the rule of law. It's not based on international juvenile justice standards or any international standards at all, really. You have kids that, based on the location in the West Bank, maybe it's a village that has weekly demonstrations against the occupation, against the confiscation of land, the root of the separation wall. These communities are impacted. These communities are where kids like Tariq, the same age, are violently abused, run through a criminal justice system that provides very little legal protection. So just briefly, we take for granted the right to counsel in the U.S. Everybody can probably recite the Miranda warnings, or at least you should be able to, because they're privileges that we enjoy that protect us. Maybe not all the time, but in theory they should. Those rights don't exist, right? A child's arrested from their home in the middle of the night, brought to an interrogation center. If they're arrested at 2 a.m., they may show up at an interrogation center in the West Bank in an Israeli settlement, being interrogated by an Israeli police officer or a military intelligence officer, say 9 a.m., 10 a.m. During that 6-7 hour transfer period, they've been in the back of a Jeep, bound and blindfolded, beaten. They've been taken out of that Jeep, brought to a military camp. They're placed outside in the rain, in cold temperatures. They don't have a jacket. They might not have shoes. This is the systematic sort of ill treatment that has been documented by our organization, but also other organizations, international organizations, UN agencies, really everyone, for over a decade. And you still have very little practical changes. When there are practical changes to the military law system, they don't really affect anything. There's a change. It used to be children were considered anyone below 16 under military law. So if you were 17, 18, you're an adult. Under Israeli law, it was anyone under 18 was considered a child, right? Sort of the basic definition of discrimination. You're treating people differently based on their identity. So that's been changed. What did it do? Not much. It doesn't affect sentencing provisions. So if you're a 16 or 17-year-old, you can still be sentenced as an adult. It didn't affect time periods for when you have to be brought before a military judge for the first time. So if you're 12, 13, 14, 15, you have to be brought before a military court judge within 48 hours. But if you're 16, 17, it's 4 days, which is the same as an adult. So really practical changes haven't happened. And that's why we need to really push for challenging the systematic impunity that exists as part of the occupation. Because I think when people think of military law, international law, the occupation, I think there's a strong focus on laws, but there's not much focus on rule of law, implementation of law, what those protections actually mean and what they're necessary to provide. And that's one thing that our organization works to do. In May, we documented the case of 2 Palestinian teenagers shot with live ammunition while they were at a demonstration. They were killed. It was caught on video, and at the time, this felt like a significant shock. People will listen. It can't be worse than this. The evidence for this case is just insurmountable. We have so much. It's on video. Come on. There has to be some type of accountability. To this day, the soldiers that are responsible for those actions, for killing those 2 kids, have not been brought to justice, have not even had any accountability of any sort produced by the Israeli military, by the Israeli government. The investigation is ongoing. It's closed. There's a gag order. You can't talk about it. There's no information about it. But what we do know from representing kids, from documenting violations of Palestinian children throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, there's very little accountability. And that's really the heart of the problem. The occupation is impunity. Attacks in Gaza, I can't say enough. It's systematic impunity. Kids are dying. Kids are being bombed. Kids have been shot, shelled, bombed for years. The siege of Gaza, it violates international law. You see governments not standing up to them and not pressuring for an end to the humanitarian crisis. A ceasefire needs to happen immediately, but that ceasefire needs to be accompanied with an actual lifting of the siege, because the status quo is not sustainable. Children will continue to bear the brunt of the violence as long as the status quo is perpetuated. So it's been depressing. So you bring a smile to my face because this room is full, and I just want to thank you for being here, for listening, and please talk, do something. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Perhaps if folks in the hallway could keep it down, that'll help for the media in the room. My name is Sunjeev Bery. I'm the Middle East North Africa Advocacy Director for Amnesty International USA. It's my privilege to join all of you here today in these very dark and troubling times. I want to thank all of the members of the press who are here, folks in the community who have been concerned, congressional staff, as well as Congressman Keith Ellison. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your opinion piece in the Washington Post. Thank you for calling for a lifting of the Gaza blockade, under which Palestinian civilians have suffered greatly for 7 years. Thank you. These are very challenging times, and in my brief comments, I'm going to talk about the human rights violations that are happening across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. We've heard the terrible story of the experiences of Tariq Khdeir, his mother, and their extended family. Sadly, they are not alone in their experiences, and Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, which includes the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as Gaza, are in a human rights crisis of massive proportions. First, it's worth talking about the crisis that I think has brought us all into this room today at this immediate moment, and that is what is happening in Gaza right now. The latest numbers are terrible. 1,400 Palestinians, perhaps many more at the time that I'm speaking now, killed. Some 50 Israeli soldiers or more killed, 3 civilians in Israel killed, and perhaps 250,000 or more Palestinian civilians in Gaza displaced from their homes, some numbers going much higher than that. Some 10% of Gaza's 1.8 million civilians now having fled their homes and sitting and lying huddled in UN schools and other UN facilities across the Gaza Strip. This is a terrible time for human rights, not only because Hamas rockets are flying into Israel, and these are indiscriminate rockets that do not discriminate between civilians or combatants, not only because those rockets are being fired, but also because the Israeli government is engaging in likely war crimes in the Gaza Strip. These likely war crimes come against a backdrop of a Gaza blockade, which for 7 years has deprived Gaza Palestinian civilians of opportunities to work and live. Every time you see a press release by the Israeli government praising itself for allowing humanitarian shipments into Gaza, remember the following. Gaza Palestinian civilians do not want humanitarian shipments. And the only reason humanitarian shipments are coming into the Gaza Strip out of necessity is because the Israeli government has shut down the Gaza economy. And as a result, Gaza Palestinians no longer have factories to work in. They no longer have jobs. You have unheard of double-digit unemployment rates that I've read reports of reach up to 40 or 50% of the population prior to this latest crisis. It's a terrible problem, and it amounts to collective punishment, and the Gaza blockade needs to be lifted immediately. In addition to that, we have the problem of what are likely war crimes by the Israeli government in its strikes in the Gaza Strip. So, for example, Gaza's main power plant has now been largely shut down as a result of strikes, which are highly likely to have originated from the Israeli military. If that's confirmed, that would not only be a grave war crime, but also amount to collective punishment, because now much of the Gaza Strip is being dropped into a situation without power for some 22 to 24 hours a day. Those Twitter pictures that you're seeing of Gaza civilians being killed, those images that are coming out into the world, if the people who are taking those photos can't charge their phones, if they can't turn on their computers because they don't have power, how is the world going to know what is happening in Gaza today? This is the problem that is faced by the 1.8 million civilians living in the Gaza Strip. That's why Amnesty International is deeply concerned and is calling for some very bold and significant moves that need to happen. One, the United Nations Security Council needs to immediately establish an arms embargo on all of the parties to the conflict. That includes Israel, Hamas, and Palestinian armed groups. Until the United Nations Security Council does so, individual nations and parties that are supplying weapons to the parties to the conflict must stop immediately. Here in the United States, Amnesty International USA is calling on the U.S. government to stop supplying weapons, arms, military equipment, and military aid to Israel. Israel is a major party to the conflict, and it is time to stop the U.S. supply of weapons, arms, and military aid to Israel. It's ridiculous that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is talking about a ceasefire while simultaneously the U.S. government is releasing more artillery shells and other forms of munitions to the Israeli government. Just yesterday, Amnesty International released the latest information on some $275 million worth of arms, equipment, and other forms of military aid that have been released over the past 2.5 years, ranging from rifle parts and rifle cartridges to missile parts and rockets to the Israeli government. Those $276 million that have been supplied in arms and munitions to the Israeli government do not include the big-ticket items like jets and naval equipment and other sorts of high technology. All of this needs to stop. All countries supplying weapons to Israel, Hamas, or Palestinian armed groups need to stop immediately, and that includes the United States. In addition to that, we need to see, with regards to the UN Security Council, immediate referral of the entire matter in a binding Security Council resolution to the International Criminal Court, so there can be a prompt investigation and potential prosecution of everyone involved in violations of international law and international human rights law, whether we're talking about Israeli soldiers or those who are firing artillery, which by its very nature is indiscriminate and untargeted, into dense civilian areas, or we're talking about Hamas militants firing rockets into civilian populations in Israel. Everyone who is violating international humanitarian law, international law, and human rights law needs to be held accountable, and the UN Security Council should do that immediately. Now I want to move to the question of what is happening in the other parts of the occupied Palestinian territories, specifically the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. What we've heard today is just one example of many in which Palestinian civilians have suffered greatly under Israeli occupation forces, the Israeli Defense Forces, and their conduct in the West Bank, in the occupied Palestinian territories. Earlier this year, in February of 2014, Amnesty International released its latest report with regards to this, called Trigger Happy. There are some copies outside, and I have a copy with me on the table for journalists who are interested in taking a look. In our report, we documented how Israeli soldiers and Israeli forces have repeatedly violated their obligations under international human rights law by using excessive force to stifle dissent and freedom of expression, resulting in a pattern of unlawful killings and injuries to civilians, including children in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So the report shows how Israeli forces have been permitted to do so with virtual impunity, and with perhaps just one exception, none of the soldiers or combatants involved in some of these violations of basic human rights have been prosecuted by the Israeli government. Just to give you an idea of some of the numbers that we're talking about, between January 2011 and December of 2013, from January 2011 to December of 2013, over 8,000 Palestinians, including at least 1,500 children, were injured by means other than live ammunition, including rubber-coated metal bullets and the reckless use of tear gas. In addition to the 8,000 or so who were injured by means other than live ammunition, some 261 Palestinians, including 67 children, were seriously injured by live ammunition fired by Israeli soldiers. In terms of deaths, according to the UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, also known as OCHA, in 2013, some 27 Palestinians were killed in the occupied Palestinian territories, West Bank, including 4 children. 8 were killed in 2012, 10 were killed in 2011. So what we're seeing in the year 2013 was a number of deaths due to excessive use of force by Israeli security forces that was more than 2011 and 2012 combined. And I want to just be clear about what numbers are not included in this. These numbers do not include cases of killings or injuries in contexts such as search and arrest operations, and the report also does not cover Israel's use of excessive force against Palestinian protesters in the Gaza Strip, such as in the buffer zone, the so-called buffer zone that's guarded by Israel. We're talking about number of deaths and wounded outside of those numbers. This, in turn, leads to a situation in which you have no accountability, in which Israeli soldiers and security forces are never held accountable, with perhaps just one exception that I know of, for these grave abuses. And all of this happens against a backdrop of repressive laws, in which you have a racist dual-track system of law in the West Bank, part of the occupied Palestinian territories, where Palestinian civilians live under Israeli military law, while Israeli settlers living in illegal settlements that are war crimes under international law, while Israeli settlers live under civilian law. So just to give you a couple of examples of the laws that Palestinian civilians live under that they are forced to violate simply by engaging in freedom of expression. Military Order 101 regarding the prohibition of acts of incitement and hostile propaganda, issued by the Israeli army commander in the West Bank region in 1967. That law has remained in place since 1967. Military Order 101 prohibits all gatherings of 10 or more persons, quote, for a political purpose or for a matter that could be interpreted as political, or even, quote, to discuss such a topic, end quote, unless they have received authorization in advance under a permit issued by the Israeli military commander in the area. So let me break that down for you. Under Israeli Military Order 101 in the occupied Palestinian territories, it is illegal for Palestinian civilians to peacefully protest the occupation they live under without the permission of the Israeli military commander enforcing the occupation. And when Palestinians do violate Military Order 101, they are at high risk of becoming one of the 8,000 or more Palestinians over the past 3 years who has experienced serious injury through bullets, rubber-coated bullets, tear gas, or other forms of violence from the Israeli military in the occupied Palestinian territories. One more example. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the penalty for breaking Israeli Military Order 101. Anyone breaching the order faces imprisonment for up to 10 years and or a hefty fine. These are the penalties for engaging in basic freedom of expression in the occupied Palestinian territories. So this is what we're up against. And I want to flag for everyone before I leave the microphone one last case, and that is the case of a man who I met a year ago when I participated in Amnesty International's research mission to the occupied Palestinian territories, specifically the West Bank. I visited the village of Kufr Kadum, which is a Palestinian village whose main road has been blocked by Israeli soldiers so that a neighboring settlement can expand into its farming territory. There I sat in the living room of a man by the name of Murad Shtewi. Murad is a community leader who has been leading peaceful protests against the settlements and the enforcement of the settlements by the Israeli military. He's now in jail. He's in jail under a combination of false charges for supposedly throwing rocks and supposedly inciting others, but also for he's also being held right now by the Israeli security forces for a demonstration without a permit, which is an example of how Palestinian civilians face harsh crackdowns from Israeli security forces simply for peacefully protesting the very reality of their occupation. For the U.S. government today, the time is coming for it to start holding the Israeli government accountable. This should have happened a long time ago. But now, with world opinion dramatically shifting in a new direction, with the images of so many dead babies, dead children, dead civilians flooding people's Twitter accounts and inboxes, It's time for a substantial shift in the way the U.S. government approaches this issue. The U.S. should stop supplying weapons to the Israeli government. The U.S. should start holding its allies accountable. And the U.S. should start standing up for the basic rights of civilians, be they Israeli, Palestinian, Jewish, whatever their ethnicity, nationality, or religion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Laila El-Haddad. I'm a Palestinian author and social activist from Gaza City. I live in Columbia, Maryland, and my tax dollars killed 8 members of my family this morning. I'd like to just take a moment to read their names. Malik, 58 years old. Osama, 34 years old. Imad, 28, Awatif, 29, Yara, 8 years old, Muhammad, 12 years old, and Lujain, 4 years old. Yara and Muhammad were fleeing their home when the second Israeli missile followed them and killed them. I would just like to take a moment of silence and prayer, please, for these fallen and the thousands of others. Thank you. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Gaza, because after all, that's why we're all here. I'd like to start by giving you a little bit of context, because all too often we hear about this as the latest cycle of violence, as a response, as a justified retaliation by Israel, as self-defense to the killing of 3 Israeli teens. The reality is, Gaza right now is being bombarded. It is completely blacked out, besieged and blockaded. This is a situation unheard of in modern history. For a population that is already largely refugees, that is already besieged, that is already stateless, to then be bombarded mercilessly with no intervention. Gaza is roughly twice the size of Washington, D.C., where we all sit today. It has a little over 1.5 million inhabitants, 1.7 going on 1.8. Most of those inhabitants are under the age of 18. They are under the age of 18. 3/4 of them are refugees, meaning they are not from the place they are compelled to live. They are from towns and villages, many of them depopulated, destroyed, ethnically cleansed by Zionist militias prior to 1948. And they sought refuge in Gaza, and they were besieged in Gaza, and they are not allowed to return to their native lands. Now, unlike the UNHCR, UNRWA, that has a mandate to provide for these refugees, does not have a protection mandate. So these Palestinians that are being targeted, literally have nowhere to run. We've heard this over and over again, but it bears reminding. And no one to protect them. No one to protect them. There are no bomb shelters, there are no sirens, there is no one to protect them. This leads many to refer to Gaza as the world's largest open-air prison. Now, this assumes, of course, that there is a crime that is punishable. So I like to refer to it more of an internment camp, or as a friend who worked for Human Rights Watch calls it, a zoo, a holding pen for animals, where it's open season 24/7, where the question of freedom of the inhabitants is never raised. The question of freedom is never raised. Now, Gaza is still legally occupied. We hear about, well, you know, Israel disengaged in 2005. They left everything. What more do they want? Rockets are still flying out of Gaza. The reality is all of Gaza's effective markers of sovereignty are still controlled by Israel. The borders, the airspace, the sea, there's a naval blockade on Gaza. The population registry, the taxation system. Any child who is born in Gaza must be registered through Israel. Families, tens of thousands of Palestinian families, are split apart, including my own, because one half of the member of the family is a resident of Gaza under Israeli law, and the other is not, and Israel denies them the right to be able to visit, to live, to reside with their own family. My husband is a refugee from northern historic Palestine. He is not allowed by Israel to come visit me when I go to Gaza, to come live with me, to go to his own land where his father was born, his ancestors lived. So again, all of Gaza's effective markers of sovereignty continue to be controlled by Israel. Now, Gaza has been subject, though, to some form of closure for more than 2 decades. This is not a recent phenomenon, by the way. We hear of it being sort of a result of in response to Hamas's election in power. The reality is, Hamas is a red herring. The blockade in its most stringent form actually started prior to the election of Hamas. I was there at the time. I was a reporter. It started immediately after Israel's disengagement in 2005. Right after that, they shut down unilaterally all of the commercial crossings, resulting in billions of dollars of loss to the Palestinian economy, decimating the economy, plunging it into unprecedented humanitarian crisis, according to Amnesty and others. Again, this is before Hamas was elected to power. They cut off Gaza from the rest of Palestine, from the rest of Palestinians, and from the world. Because it is not just Gaza. Gaza cannot survive on its own as an independent entity. It is part of the greater Palestinian nation. It is part of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and other Palestinians as well who are denied their right to return, living in camps on the outside. Now, this is a siege, by the way, that has gotten more and more stringent over the years, that is not a siege that targets Hamas or whoever the Israelis say it is targeting. It is in the Israeli architects' own words, those who designed this siege. In their own words, it was designed to target Gaza's productive sector, cripple the freedoms of the Palestinians, and deny them their most basic human rights. And this is, I quote, when pressed by the Israeli High Court a few years ago about the purpose of the siege. They came back and said, the tenets are no development, no prosperity, no humanitarian crisis. In other words, the siege is intended to stifle development, to stifle prosperity, Palestinian prosperity, but not to get things so bad that it creates a media outcry and humanitarian crisis. So enough foodstuffs and goods are allowed into Gaza, a trickle, just enough to keep them teetering on the edge. And in fact, there is a caloric equation. Just enough calories are allowed in to make sure that there is food for the population, foods that because of sort of universal unemployment there and impoverishment, people cannot buy, cannot access. And this has resulted in mass aid dependence. Something like 80% of Palestinians in Gaza are now food insecure, meaning they rely on some sort of food ration to be able to survive. This should not be the case. This is artificial, this is purposeful, this is deliberate, this is calculated, this is malicious. The siege is also, in the words of the Israeli army, intended to further the fragmentation of the Palestinian people and separate them from one another, from their counterparts in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in 1948 territories, now Israel, and on the outside. It is a siege that has restricted Gaza's fishing zone, one of its main industries. Gaza is a coastal territory, to 3 nautical miles. Now, Oslo gave Palestinians the right, I say restricted it, to 20 nautical miles. They are allowed to fish 3 nautical miles into sea. If you go, as I did last June with Anthony Bourdain, and you go to the fishing markets in Gaza, all of the fish that you will see are about this big. There's nothing for them to fish anymore. It is a siege that restricts farmers' ability to reach their farmland, half of which is along the border area that is now under Israeli control, part of the buffer zone, restricts their ability to reach their farmland at the risk of being shot, at the risk of being incarcerated, which we often hear of. Again, you don't hear of these Palestinians being killed, these fishermen being shot at, these farmers, these shepherds. This is what is happening as a result of the siege. It is a siege that restricts, denies, categorically bans Palestinian students in Gaza from going to study in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and other universities. There is a categorical ban. Remember, they make up the majority of Gaza's population. It is a siege that largely bans the exports of any of Gaza's goods outside of Gaza, the movement of people in and out of Gaza, as well as the import of construction materials to be able to rebuild the factories, the homes. This was after Operation Cast Light, and we're going to be facing the same problem now after the current assault. The result, as I said, is universal male unemployment, which in turn has resulted in increased poverty rates, massive aid dependence, and food insecurity. And to be clear, there is no shortage of food in Gaza, just radically and purposefully reduced access to these foods. Almost zero purchasing power. All this is happening while Israel preserves its right, speaking of the status quo, to strike Gaza at any moment, to strike any facility, anywhere, to assassinate at will, to incarcerate, and to blockade Gaza. It preserves this right. Palestinians, meanwhile, are asked to remain silent in the face of all of this, in the face of these unspeakable brutalities, extermination, and slow silent strangulation. We have only the right to remain silent. Once this picture is painted, you can then begin to understand what life is like, what life has been like for Palestinians in Gaza, and that no sane person would tolerate, no peoples would tolerate this status quo comprised of such asphyxiating conditions carefully designed to crush their will to survive, their normalcy, and their freedoms and productivity. Nobody would accept this. I spoke about the fishermen, I spoke about the farmers. One farmer I met in 2010, Muhammad Sultan, he was at a farming workshop put on by a union trying to learn how to rebuild his life, because Palestinians in Gaza don't sit quietly and resign themselves to the status quo. They want to survive, they want to continue to exist, because for them existence is a form of resistance. And I asked him why he was there, what had happened, and he said 500 acres of his land were systematically razed to the ground by Israeli bulldozers and 50 of his beehives. And he was trying to make a difficult decision of whether he should replant those trees that take years to become fruitful, and in the meantime become aid dependent, or resort to horticulture or some other method of livelihood and income. I see farmers all the time. I saw a farmer planting not once, twice, for the third time his olive groves, happily with a smile on his face, in Beit Lahia, saying they uprooted all of his olive trees, but he was going to continue to go and plant his land because this was his way of surviving, of resisting peacefully. Fishermen who, to counter the naval blockade, have created inland freshwater fish farms, which is absurd to think you would need a freshwater fish farm in Gaza. But this is sort of the ingenuity of the population there that continues to survive and be resilient. Now on to the current situation, I'll close with that. We got some of the figures, 1,400 Palestinians killed. And it's not just, again, figures and statistics. More than 55 families in their entirety, completely eviscerated, by the way. Families huddled together in their homes, children like my family members running for safety. And thousands maimed and traumatized. More disturbing are accounts we hear of UNRWA schools taking direct hits despite multiple reports to the Israelis of their location being given to the Israeli army. Just as recent as 2 days ago. And of course we heard about the power plant being bombed, which I'm very active on Twitter, and immediately after it was bombed, 24 hours later, the Gaza Twitterverse went silent. There were hundreds, this was what really marked this assault different from other ones, hundreds of eyewitnesses giving minute-by-minute accounts as young as 15 and 16 years old as they were being bombarded, as they were fleeing for safety, of what was happening. It went silent. So sort of you can draw the connection there. And I'd like to just end with this account from my aunt, Dr. Muna Al-Farra, who is a physician and a women's and human rights activist in Gaza. And she was seeing a couple of young children in this tertiary care clinic being sent from the main hospital, which is flooded. And she gave this account to me in this email yesterday morning. She said, "First, I'll begin with the story of an unnamed child we call number 6. He was around 3 years, and I had identifying stickers on his arm saying unknown and number 6. I was shocked. I immediately asked the nurses and ambulance drivers what his name was. I was told no one knew. No one knew. They found him in a mass of destroyed houses. And he was the only survivor of his family. He had a head injury and wounds to other parts of his body. Immediately I asked, doesn't anyone remember where the house was? They said it was in the area where they found him. All the buildings were destroyed and mixed up with one another, and sometimes children are thrown from one area to another, so nobody knew where he lived. Nobody knew. And then I realized, my aunt said, he's number 6. And that means there was 5 other unknown children before him, and many, many more children after him. I stopped asking questions because I needed to do my work. Second is the story of Reem Ahmed, 6 years old. Reem arrived in the X-ray unit. She has a name also, and she used to have a family. She was the only surviving member. She lost her parents and all of her brothers and sisters, and she was injured in the head. These are just 2 small examples of what is being done in Gaza. Now we hear a lot of talk of Israel's need to defend itself, its right to defend itself, of Israel's security. But you know, Israel's security can never be derived from imprisoning, bombarding, systematically incarcerating, demolishing houses, and repressing the indigenous population of Palestine. We're talking about Gaza today, but Gaza is just a symbol of the broader Palestinian struggle. It is, in the words of Mahmoud Darwish, a brutal lesson, a pilot project. And I'll end with this. UNRWA spokesperson Chris Guinness has said on Twitter that after the Israeli attacks on the first UN school, there's been 2 others since this tweet, UN schools turned shelters using military aid, US military aid. We should all hang our heads in shame, but that from this shame should come justice and dignity, and I should add security, freedom, and accountability for the Palestinian people. Thank you so much.
Before we take a few questions, I'd like to ask Congressman Keith Ellison to come up and deliver some remarks.
I'd simply like to welcome all of you to Capitol Hill, ask you to continue to come here. This is your house, this is the people's house, and that for whatever answers might be found here, given the U.S.'s involvement in this matter, that you would knock the doors and walk the halls and talk about the cases and talk about the people. I want to give a special thank you and congratulations to Tariq, who very bravely told his story eloquently and honorably, and he came to visit me yesterday. And I want to thank you for visiting me again. I also want to thank your mother and father. I'm a father of 4 myself, and brother, I don't know what I'd do if I saw my son's face looking like that. And I guess I'd be grateful that he's still alive, but I'd be heartbroken. And so I just say my prayers are with you, and certainly with you, ma'am. So that's all I want. I want to thank our experts who gave us good testimony, and I just want to say that if there's one thing that we really do need to do is to occupy and be in this space on Capitol Hill much more. And we are contemplating another meeting, a briefing after the August recess, and hopefully we get a bigger room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Ellison. We really appreciate all of your courageous work in standing for a ceasefire and a lifting of the blockade, as Sunjeev mentioned. In the few minutes that we have left, I'd like to open this up for very brief questions from the audience, and I'd like to turn over the floor to any congressional staff people or media who may have questions. What we'll do is we'll take maybe 3 at a time, and then the panelists can decide which particular one they would like to answer. And I'd ask the panelists to speak into these 2 thin mics when they respond, because those are the ones that pick up the sound. So with that, are there any questions? Okay, so yes, please.
Thanks for speaking so far. I just wanted to know if any of our panelists would like to offer their view or commentary of the kidnapping of an Israeli officer and British citizen this morning.
Okay. Yes, please.
A lot of the excuse that a lot of people give, for example, that when they call our office, is that Hamas is firing rockets into Israeli territory indiscriminately. And while, yes, that is a human rights violation, and yes, that is an atrocity, but how do you counter that? Basically framing it in such a way that Israel is not the victim in this situation, that the Palestinians are.
And do we have a third question? In the back, please. Yeah.
I was wondering if the panel considers this what's going on with Israel right now a violation of the 1976 Arms Control Act.
Great. So I'm going to turn this over to the panelists. Would anyone like the first question?
So, just the first question. So I think, in the context of what's happening now, right, we also have to place this in the context of a 7-year-long siege, right? I think it's not accurate to just situate it in the present. So when it comes to indiscriminate attacks, right, Hamas is guilty of that. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all the international human rights agencies, indiscriminate rocket attacks on a civilian population amount to a war crime. So does targeting UN schools, so does targeting hospitals, bombing civilian structures, targeting civilians directly, targeting children directly. Those also amount to war crimes. So it's not, it's important to think about the context in Gaza. Someone else's war crime doesn't justify your war crime. International humanitarian law is individual, right, to a state. If another party to a conflict violates international law, that doesn't justify, widespread attacks on a civilian population. Both parties are obligated, and both parties should be held accountable for international humanitarian law violations. So I think that's the starting point. Nobody's a victim, right? It doesn't matter about victims. It's about rule of law. It's about implementing specific and precise calculations into who can be targets and who can't. Civilian population can't be a target, no matter who the actor is. And I think that's what is missing from a lot of the dialogue that surrounds the current conflict, but also doesn't really raise itself within the broader context of the Israeli occupation and the impact that it has on the Palestinian population. Do you want to say something on that?
So I recall the first two questions. There were three, though. There's one on the capture of an Israeli soldier, one on the question of rockets, and then the third?
Arms export control.
Okay. So on the first question, with regards to the capture of an Israeli soldier, there are extensive provisions and protections under international law with regards to prisoners of war and captured soldiers. I don't have the full text of the Geneva Conventions that apply to that in front of me. I will point out a few things right now that apply to soldiers captured in battle or combatants captured in battle. One, they should not be treated as a hostage. That means that individuals captured on the battlefield should not be treated as bargaining chips or in other ways as a hostage, and this applies to all of the parties to the conflict, Hamas, Palestinian armed groups, as well as the Israeli military and those who it has captured. With regards to the specific individual who may have been captured and others who may have been captured, they should be allowed to communicate freely with their family, including through sending and receiving letters. They need to be well treated and held in humane and dignified living conditions, and they need to be given immediate access to the International Committee of the Red Cross. There are more details in international law with regards to the treatment of prisoners of war and captured combatants that we can talk about later. With regards to the second question, no policymaker or elected official should be forced to take sides on the question of human rights. Human rights means that every civilian should be protected in the context of conflict and war. There should be no collective punishment, which it applies as a description to the Gaza blockade. And policymakers and elected officials ought to have and exert the freedom to stand up for human rights, whatever the ethnicity, nationality, or religion of the people impacted. One way to think about this is the following. The U.S. government provides funding for the Iron Dome, which protects Israeli civilians from some rockets fired by Hamas militants and Palestinian armed groups. Where is the Iron Dome for civilians in Gaza to protect them against artillery fire and other munitions that are fired in the context of war crimes by the Israeli military, which is supplied by the United States? Where is the Iron Dome for Palestinians in Gaza? So that's the basic question. Is the U.S. government going to hold not just its perceived adversaries accountable, but also its allies accountable for standing up for basic human rights?
I think it's important that the death tolls really speak for themselves. Let's not forget that before any Israeli civilians were killed by Hamas rocket fire, which of course we condemn against civilians, over 300 Palestinians had been killed At that time, it was about a third of whom at least had been children, 4/5 had been civilians, mostly women and children. So the death tolls really speak for themselves, and we really need to value all human life equally. I sincerely believe that had the lives of Palestinian children been valued by the Israeli government as they value the lives of Jewish children, we would not have the high death tolls that we do. It's also very important to note right now that we are not funding Hamas rocket fire. We condemn Hamas rocket fire. We are funding Israeli rocket fire that have killed, over 1,400 people, 4/5 of whom are civilians. And let's not forget that the UN, bodies of the UN have said that Israel clearly is intentionally targeting civilians and civilian targets. And this is happening in our name as Americans because we're funding it, and it's our duty to stand up against it, both before God and before international human rights law.
I'll make it brief. Friends, don't let friends kill children.
Yes.
Just briefly on the question of the Arms Export Control Act, the uses to which U.S. weapons can be put by a foreign country are strictly limited to internal security and legitimate self-defense. I think what we've heard here very clearly from all of the panelists here today is that the use of force by Israel is in no way legitimate self-defense. It's being used to commit what we've heard of being likely war crimes and so forth. And the challenge, I think, for this audience on Capitol Hill is to ensure that these laws are being applied, because no, Israel should not be held to a different standard. It should be held to the exact same standard that we have for other countries. And for violating the Arms Export Control Act, there are clear consequences. A nation cannot receive any deliveries of arms or weapons or ammunition if it's in violation of this law. So if Congress is serious about the laws which it passes in these halls, then it has to apply this law to Israel. Okay, we have time for maybe two more quick questions. So let me do 1 and 2 here. Go ahead, please.
So a lot of the justification for Israel's attacks on the Palestinian territories in the Gaza Strip is that Hamas is hiding rockets in civilian-controlled areas like mosques and hospitals. What would your response be to that argument?
Yes, please.
Given the fact that Israel's Iron Dome is successful in blocking rockets, is it correct to say that any rocket retaliation by Israel is illegal given the dense civilian population in Gaza, and that it should not launch any rockets? And in fact, if it had not done so, it would have been better for its own security by not fomenting greater hatred against it, and in that way helping Hamas.
So I'll take the first question that might tie into the second briefly. I think it's similar to what I said previously. So the justification that human shields, allow somebody to disregard civilian casualties, that's not international humanitarian law. That's wrong, right? If Israel knows that there are missiles under a school, in a hospital, they know that civilians are there, then the presumption is that's not a military target. You can't attack that target. And that's the calculation. I mean, each target needs to be evaluated in that way. You need to distinguish between military objects, between civilian objects. Once you do that, if that military object is going to cause a disproportionate impact to civilian life, civilian structure, civilian infrastructure, you still cannot bomb that because there's the principle of distinction, the principle of proportionality. And we see, the attacks currently, previous attacks in November 2012, attacks in Operation Cast Lead by the Israeli military have really been characterized by complete disregard of international law, complete disregard of civilian life. And it goes back to the blockade. I think the blockade is characterized by complete disregard of civilian life. And there's no distinction. There's very little proportionality in any of it. Did you want to add something?
With regards to the question of the storage of Hamas and Palestinian armed groups' munitions, Amnesty International has been closely monitoring such reports. To date, we have not seen any evidence of Gaza civilians being compelled to be human shields, as the Israeli government has claimed. We've not seen any evidence to support that Hamas members have pushed or forced Gaza civilians to act as human shields. We have noted incidences where Hamas members have stored rockets near civilian areas, and there are, of course, the reports of the several UN schools or facilities where rockets have been found. It's important to note, though, that those schools were not actively being used at that time. So with regards to the question, to the extent that the question is focused on the following scenario of rockets being stored in or around actively civilian-populated structures, Amnesty International has not found evidence to suggest that there are, in fact, munitions or rockets being stored in facilities where civilians are sitting as refugees or internally displaced people.
Meanwhile, I should add there is ample evidence, well-documented evidence by Israeli human rights groups of Israeli soldiers using Palestinians as human shields. That's never discussed, though, in the media. And then I'll just end by saying Malik, Osama, Imad, Awatif, Muhammad, Lujain, Yara, all of these children and their parents and grandchildren that were killed this morning had no weapons in their house. Neither did the 4 young Bekir boys who were playing soccer with journalists on the beach that were targeted as they ran for shelter.
The argument that Hamas hides weapons in active civilian areas has not only been debunked by Amnesty International, but it's very similar to the weapons of mass destruction argument that we used against Iraq, which we have still not found those weapons of mass destruction. We still have not found those weapons that are stored in active civilian sites. And I think Ayman Muhyiddin, NBC's reporter, he witnessed 4 children playing on the beach. There was no weapons anywhere around them, and he saw those 4 children blown to pieces. I have a 4-year-old child. It's unimaginable. Again, Israel must value all human life equally, and that talking point about Hamas hiding those weapons is straight out of a playbook that Israel paid thousands of dollars to come up with talking points to win over a Western audience. We need to see past their talking points and look at the realities.
Would you like to say anything, Tariq? Okay.
I mean, it's actually very similar, to my client Tariq, where they claimed he was throwing Molotov cocktails, which is completely false. We have a Georgetown University student who witnessed the beating of Tariq. It happened on his family's land. He was not engaging in any illegal activity, and he witnessed what happened. And yet the Israeli police tried to claim that he was throwing Molotov cocktails, which for me is irrelevant because nothing can justify restraining the hands of a child and beating him after his hands are restrained. But nonetheless, Israel has a history of blaming the victim and fabricating lies to do that, and we've documented that.
I want to profoundly thank all of our panelists for their heartfelt words here, their expert testimony, their work for justice and for peace. Tariq and Suha Abu Khdeir, Hassan Shibly to my left, Laila El-Haddad, Brad Parker, and Sunjeev Bery. Thank you all for attending. For more information about this issue, please see the website of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation at endtheoccupation.org. Thank you very much for coming.